He's a symbol for Venezuela's opposition. Leopoldo Lopez led the first major movement against Nicolas Maduro. That was over 5 years ago. The protests ended in failure and Lopez's detention. Fast forward to Tuesday. Lopez escapes from house arrest. He says soldiers freed him. It's the beginning of the latest military uprising against Maduro, one that so far has again failed to dislodge Venezuela's leader. Right now, once more, Leopoldo Lopez is confined, this time to the Spanish embassy. But the opposition leader says his stay there won't be long because Venezuela's leadership, he believes, is poised to switch sides.
I have been meeting with commanders, with generals. I have been holding talks with the different factions of the military, and we agreed to put an end to this usurpation of power.
But Nicolas Maduro has been trying to show he still commands the troops' loyalty. He addressed scores of them at the Caracas Military Academy. On stage with him, some of the leadership, a signal that they're literally behind him. But the leader also sees rebellion in the ranks.
We cannot give 1 inch to the traitors, to the conspirators. We must go on the offensive and be active. Everyone must follow the command and detain any traitors.
Still, Maduro supporters are at pains to sound a harmonious note after days of turmoil. The tune from the government, Maduro is still number one. But with the loyalty of his army far from assured, Tuesday's discord could very well be reprised.
Well, Europe has been criticized for its relative silence this week regarding events in Venezuela. Earlier, we spoke to Andreas. He is a member of the German parliament with Chancellor Merkel's CDU party, and he sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
I think we have a clear position that Juan Guaido is the legitimate interim president of Venezuela in accordance with the constitution of Venezuela. We call on everyone involved to refrain from violence and seek a peaceful solution through a national dialogue and a democratic transition that can only be resolved through fair and free elections. And to enable that and to make that possible, I think Maduro has to step aside. I think there were rumors the last couple of days he was already plotting his refuge to Cuba. I'm not clear how realistic that scenario is, but it's clear that neither Maduro nor Guaido at the moment can secure the full support of the authorities in Venezuela. So that stalemate may continue for quite a while. I think we have been strongly supportive of all the countries in the region, in the Lima Group, working together for a peaceful transition in the country. We should never forget that there's a refugee crisis with more than 10%, more than 3 million people from Venezuela who have left their country into all neighboring countries of the region, which is a significant risk of destabilizing the region as a whole. So we strongly support our partners in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and other countries who are involved in that. I was in the region myself in February together with the federal president, and we support in terms of giving refuge to the people fleeing Venezuela, in terms of securing humanitarian support for those remaining in Venezuela, and in working towards a peaceful transition. And I think once it gets going, we can be even more helpful in terms of supervising and monitoring with EU facilities an election process that should be fair and legitimate and produce a new government for Venezuela.
And that was Andreas there speaking with us. He's a member of the German parliament and sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So where are we now in Venezuela? To talk about that, I'm joined by Francisco Marquez. He is a political advisor to opposition leader Juan Guaido. Francisco was imprisoned by President Nicolás Maduro for 4 months. After his release, he left the country. He joins me tonight from Washington, D.C. Francisco, welcome. It's good to have you back on the program. I know that you've been answering this question today from a lot of people, and it's still relevant tonight. Explain the last 48 hours to us. Was this a political gamble that did not pay off?
Well, I would actually argue that we've seen the highest level defections in the last 48 hours than we've ever had during this process. I always call to mind Manuel Christopher. He was the director of intelligence of the regime, and it is widely known fact that he contributed and coordinated with President Guaido. And just to give you another fact, the highest level political prisoner of the regime, Leopoldo Lopez, was also able to leave the house arrest, and he's currently on the street, just like Juan Guaido. If this was such a coup d'etat, or if the Maduro has full control of security forces, why is President Guaido still on the street, still practicing politics, still trying to restore constitutional order?
Well, Francisco,
so my argument and President Guaido's argument is that we've actually moved forward and Maduro's weaker now than he was 48 hours ago.
Francisco, do you know how many soldiers now support Juan Guaido?
Well, for strategic purposes, we can't get into that. But I can tell you that the majority of the security forces are with President Guaido. And it's no secret. We have to be very upfront with the people. There are still some security forces with the regime. That's not a surprise. But what has surprised many people is the level of support that President Guaido has for security forces. And we will continue to see more defections as days and as moving forward, for sure.
But so that's something you can confirm, that the majority of soldiers, the majority of the military is now with Juan Guaido.
Yes, as we have stated before, the transition is a process. These sometimes take, unfortunately, more time than we would like. But if I would have told you 2 weeks ago that the director of intelligence of the regime was in coordination with interim President Guaido, you probably would not have believed me. But now that's a fact. And it's so true that they just replaced him with another figure. Just like it's true that Maduro right now is surrounded by people that promised that he would leave that day. This is a complicated issue, but rest assured that the people of Venezuela, millions of people on the street, support President Guaido. And that's what's most important. Guaido has the people's hearts, and Guaido has the people's interests in all of his policies and in everything he's trying to do.
Francisco, how do you explain the military parade that we saw today in Caracas with Nicolas Maduro? I mean, he was standing there with his top military men beside him.
Yeah, and I invite you to, if you can post that clip where the Minister of Defense says that people were trying to buy him off, and the surprise face of the regime of Nicolas Maduro. This was an act, a show. Maduro is weaker than he's ever been, and anybody can paint a picture with a couple of security forces around him, and that's what Maduro's trying to do. But the fact of the matter is he's lost control. And as I mentioned before, Leopoldo Lopez, the top political prisoner, left his house. And he was surrounded by intelligence officials and military counterintelligence. And he left with no problem. That's because they followed interim President Guaido's order.
Francisco, I want to ask you, there are reports that opposition leaders spent months in secret talks with top Maduro officials, including Venezuela's defense minister, Mr. Leopoldo Lopez. I mean, did those talks really take place?
Yes, I can confirm that on behalf of President Guaido. And as we have said before, there are other talks. This is only the tip of the iceberg. As we have mentioned before, international pressure and domestic pressure is working. It is creating the conditions for more and more defections and more fractures. And that's why the pressure will continue.
Is the U.S., is the United States, is it taking part in these talks as well?
This is a Venezuelan-led movement by the Venezuelan people and for the Venezuelan people. It's the same reason that on January 23rd, when President Guaido swore oath to office, we had the support of more than 20 countries that day. Obviously, the U.S. supported us, but now we have more than 56 countries. So everything we're doing is Venezuelan-led, but definitely supported by the international community.
What about the speculation that the opposition may have been tricked by Mr. Padrino and others close to Maduro into thinking that a deal was being put into place? I mean, were you guys set up?
I don't believe that's the case. Again, look at the support. This was a nationwide movement by security forces. This is only the tip of the iceberg. And we will definitely see how everything plays out in the next couple days and next couple weeks as the pressure continues. As we said before, Maduro's surrounded by people that wanted his head on a platter, and he knows that now, and now it's public.
I want to ask you about what Elliot Abrams, the U.S. envoy for Venezuela, he claims that the U.S. did not take part in the negotiations between the opposition and members of the Maduro regime, but he says there is a document that talks about a plan for Maduro leaving. Have you seen that document?
I cannot comment on that matter, but what I can say is the talks between high-level regime officials and interim President Guaido did take place, and that those talks were significant. And in those talks, these regime officials promised that Maduro would be out. And as I said before, this is a complicated and complex process, but in the following weeks, in the following days, we will see more to come.
We've got a soundbite of the U.S. president. He was talking today about Venezuela. Let me see if we can play that right now. Take a listen to what he said about Venezuela.
I'd like to begin by sending our prayers to the people of Venezuela in their righteous struggle for freedom. The brutal repression of the Venezuelan people must end, and it must end soon. People are starving. They have no food. They have no water. And this was once one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So we wish them well. We'll be there to help, and we are there to help.
We wish them well. Does that sound like a U.S. president who is ready to go to bat for you, Francisco? What are you hearing from the White House?
We definitely think the prayers of the president and the Venezuelan people and all the world. And I would just like to say this has been a bipartisan issue for the last years. And right now we have the full support of the United States government to restore democracy in Venezuela. So the commitment is strong from the U.S. and from the most Latin America. Today we've seen more and more comments by Colombia and by Lima Group members that they will support President Guaido in everything he's done. And I would just like to highlight very quickly the unprecedented nature of what you've seen. We saw an interim president ordering security forces to restore constitutional order against a usurping regime, and that most of the international community in Latin America supported this movement. There was no condemnation and there was no violence during this situation. So that is very rare and unprecedented. And so we have the full support of the democracies in our region and in the world.
Before we run out of time, I just want to ask you, do you believe that Nicolas Maduro is holding on to power with the help of Russia?
There are definitely bad actors in Venezuela, just like Cuba and Russia. And this is a fact. But I would like to say on Russia that Russia is not a monolith. There are high-level officials in Russia that are definitely not pleased with how some people are handling the Venezuelan situation in Russia. It is in the very interest of Russia and China to restore democracy in Venezuela, because the fact of the matter is that Russia or China will never get its investment back under the Maduro regime. It will have an open and frank discussion with the democratic forces in the future once democracy is restored.
Francisco Marquez, political advisor to Venezuela's opposition leader Juan Guaido. Francisco, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. I hope we talk again soon. Thank you.